I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zeiss-Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark on a Planar Odysseys. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to
I'm
Arcane
Mark
Mark. And I'm Linda Zeiss-Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Well, there we go.
A little bit of echo there. Sorry about that.
That's right.
I see that we have already a vote in polls for design, diary, skills, and proficiency, as well as one for planes, trains, and automobiles, vehicles, and TTRPGs.
All right. So today we're going to be talking about planes and not vehicles.
Yes.
Not vehicles. Planes, like the outer planes, the inner planes, the extra-dimensional planes, the great beyond. Mm-hmm. And so when we want to talk about Planar Odysseys in TTRPGs, or RPGs in general, really, where you go into other planes, I would say that I have seen this done really well, and I'm a big fan. Like, I always like Planescape. I like going into other planes, but I've also seen it done poorly. And an example, sometimes me, when I was just starting out, I was obsessed with plot and ideas where you would go to other planes or travel in certain ways. And it's fair to say that at least one or two of my players were not as thrilled about it when I first started off. Then I learned and I got better. And one of the ways to think about this is, why are these planar adventures exciting? Why are they interesting when they are? And where did they come from in our collective culture, in myth and in legend?
Planar adventures are generally intended to bring the characters to a place where there are aspects of their surroundings and their culture that are unfamiliar, some of which they may have been able to learn about in advance, but not all of which they've been able to learn about in advance. So they're going to need to be adapting as they go along. They're going to be out of their comfort zone, and they're going to encounter experiences that cause them to grow in new ways and make decisions that they wouldn't be able to make in their starting default environment.
Normal changes in a planar adventure, and just like the word Odyssey that we used in the description of this episode, planar adventures are kind of like literally the Odyssey, or Celtic stories about wayfarers on ships who went to these islands that were essentially otherworlds with weird magic or different rules, or the voyages of Sinbad the Sailor, or even like a sci-fi story where you're going around on your spaceship to these other planets and into outer space and finding all sorts of things that are unusual and don't make sense. Even going all the way back to the ancient Greek sci-fi story that itself was based on fake travelogues where the person would make up stories about other places on Earth that they'd supposedly traveled to with strange creatures, unusual rules, and even different sort of like magical properties sometimes that took place there. And so that is where these planar adventures fit in when it comes to our collective cultural heritage and when it comes to myths and legends.
And now with the fantasy setting, you're going to naturally have some things about your game world that are distinct from our own lived experience. But with the planar adventure, with the otherworld, you're going into a place that breaks the rules that you already established in a way that you can't just do by moving one town over. So planar adventures can sometimes be similar to adventures that go, say, to other planets, because you can have changes to fundamental rules. You can change, how does gravity work? Rohit was talking in chat about, in the plane of air, everyone can fly. Are you in a plane where, everything weighs vastly less and carrying capacity is completely different and everyone can constantly high jump? Or are you in a plane where, everywhere there is toxic air location, where everywhere there's toxic gas and so you have to take certain precautions against that? Or everywhere there's flames? Are you in a place where, are there certain things that characters have come to expect or rely on that just don't exist?
Right. So when you think about what Linda just said, the fact that your setting in your normal RPG or tabletop RPG is already different than our world, at least usually, unless you're playing something that's like a modern non-fantasy RPG, which is possible. But that means that because of the fact that these other planes or other planets, if you want to use it in the metaphor with sci-fi, or other islands that have their own weird rules, whatever they are, because they violate and break those rules for your standard setting, that also means it's important to establish those rules of the standard setting before you go off into the other plane. Otherwise, you're going to lose some of that impact, some of that emotional feeling of like exploration, mystery, and being new. So ideally, you want to wait until those standard rules of the fantasy setting have become second nature to your players, to the point where they become ingrained and familiar, and your players know they can count on those standard rules of the basic fantasy setting, and they know them like the back of their hand.
This is part of why you often see Planar Adventures being a mid to high level type of story. Another reason has to do with the part of what Robo was talking about in chat, which is that it also allows you to place high level NPCs without disturbing your original setting, to have high powered people who live in another world. Because then what you can do is you can have the kinds of problems that the PCs run into to start with, and then there's this vast cosmic separation between the world the PCs start in and a place that can be threatened by giant things that help, things that are just on another level, that helps to explain, well, why weren't these things threatening the PCs and their world until now?
Right. And so another reason why these adventures tend to be at higher levels is because the special rules of the plane don't always have to be something beneficial, like that you can jump farther. Sometimes these planes or locations are inherently dangerous to go there. However, that doesn't mean you have to use them at a higher level. This episode is not about saying, oh yeah, you can't use planes until you reach a certain level. But if you want to use them as an introductory adventure to a new campaign, I would recommend doing that with a group that is already somewhat experienced with the sort of standards of that game or setting, so they can experience the breath of fresh air or the difference or the mystery of the fact that the planes are different. If they have never even playing with someone who's never even played D&D or Pathfinder or anything like that, and you're like, all right, our first adventure is going to be Planescape. And we're going to settle the City of Doors. And that's where we're going to start everything. And that's their first experience. Then it's harder to get that feeling of, like, what is different, what is unusual about this.
Because then it just kind of gets blended in together with the, oh, this is a fantasy setting, as opposed to being like, this is a different take on what's going on in this fantasy setting.
That becomes their normal rather than the basic setting. And so it tells a different story, which is something that's possible to do, but it doesn't have the same sort of otherworldly impact that you get from legends and myths about exploring these dimensions, these other places, these other realms.
It's often the case when you tell these kinds of stories, like what you were talking about with the Odyssey, that the journey is something that's very important, and the journey is not necessarily straightforward. You know, it might take gathering considerable resources to go to another world, or it might be another plane or what have you, or, you know, if it doesn't and you travel in, say, accidentally because you activated a portal and then you pass through, then the question might arise of, okay, now how do you get back home after this? So there's still then going to be the journey, but the journey is more on how do we return. You don't as often see planar stories where you can leave the planar environment whenever you want to go shopping for goods, or, you know, where you can quickly pop into the planar environment to fight a few encounters whenever you feel like getting some XP. They're usually something that feels like it's difficult to travel to and from.
That's right. One of the important things about any Planar Odyssey is why. And usually the answer isn't just, well, we like the planes, so we decided to go to the planes. But usually there's a question of why. And one of the reasons why is stranded. That's a classic Planar Odyssey trope. The original Odyssey is sort of this, although, like, at first they weren't stranded. They were just trying to get back home. being stranded, just trying to get back home. You're out in these planes. You're out in this weird place where things are going on. And all you want is to find your way back home. And that can be a type of science fiction story too, right? There's all sorts of science fiction stories where they're just trying to find a way back to Earth, and you're not there right now. You're not in the right place, like Star Trek Voyager or Battlestar Galactica have that kind of stranded sense from the Odyssey.
Another very common one is sort of the quest for the legendary MacGuffin that can't be found in our world, whether that's, knowledge that has been lost, or, an artifact of purest fire or something like that. Something that you can't get otherwise, and therefore have to make this giant journey for. Something that's particularly rare. And when I say lost, then it could be something that was once in your world but is no longer, or it could be something that, because your world has come kind of out of phase, or that sort of thing.
So looking for the MacGuffin in the plane is just very common, and those are also all the way back to legendary mythological stories where the MacGuffin could be an item. It could be a person who's gone and they've gotten stranded on that plane. They're lost there, or they've been trapped or imprisoned there. Story of Orpheus and Eurydice going down into the underworld or some kind of a hell to go after a person or an item, or in the case of Heracles, he just wanted to capture the guard dog because that was one of his labors that he had to do.
So
it was a quest.
That gets to another related sort of topic, is that it could be some kind of a metaphysical trial that awards something for something intangible for defeating it. Like maybe you need to complete this trial in order to win the favor of a deity, or maybe you need to complete this trial in order to unlock some sort of wellspring of power within you, or something like that. Or maybe you're just looking to complete the trial because then you will have proven yourself, and then be able to, is it entirely internal? Is it trying to get recognition, or to, maybe you're trying to unlock some kind of a favor politically, or things like that.
Absolutely. And that goes into the next type of planar story.
It makes me think of how, Hell Knights have to defeat a devil in order to advance.
Although they can do that on the material plane.
They can do that on the material plane, but you could imagine a version of that story that was, where they don't just summon in a devil and beat it up. They have to go and do this kind of journey.
Yeah, and there are many stories of these sort of godly or deific trials. That sort of also moves into a similar but different type of sort of Odyssey or journey story, which is the one that's performed sort of for wanderlust and to explore and chronicle what's there. So that includes stories even like Dante's Divine Comedy, where he kind of goes on this trip and he's just trying to tell you what he saw, obviously for political gain because he puts all of his enemies in hell, but theoretically, he's just telling you what he saw about these three different planes that he went to of hell, purgatory, and heaven. And there are many other mythological or legendary characters who do it just because, hey, nobody's been there, or we don't know what's there. I'm going to do it so I can tell you what it was. So
it could be curiosity. It could also be, hey, this portal opened up and now dangerous creatures or other threats are coming out of it. We need someone to go in and explore and figure out a way to stop threat.
Exactly. And so generally going there to take the fight back to an incursion is a related theme, where sometimes there's stories about creatures are coming from this other world or other dimension to attack us. And we've defended, but it's obvious that if all we do is defend, nothing is going to change. And so we went to their home turf and fought them there. And so that's another type of planar story. In general, in a TTRPG, that's one of the highest level possible stories that you can tell. Because when you're going into this entire other dimension to beat them up, you've got to be strong enough to actually successfully do that. Unless it's like the pillow dimension or something like that, where it's really weak.
Speaking of the pillow dimension, though, you can sometimes have planes act as sort of a ultimate place of rest and repose and sort of reflection and enlightenment, where the PCs are able to, you might more often see demi-planes and those types of things falling into this role, but they can raise interesting questions about, how long do the PCs stay in the place of peace, and when do they decide to return home, and is the place of peace really a happy, shiny place of peace, or is there's something else under the surface? Because, when you can play with all of the assumptions, you might have things where, there's wide-scale illusions or wide-scale magic or other things where things really aren't what they expect. And you can keep unwinding the layers.
So we talked about a lot of the motivations behind planar travel. Let's talk about one other way you can split up a planar travel story into two major types. So one of these two types, more similar to the Odyssey or some of those Celtic stories where they go to all sorts of islands, is the plane hopping is the planar version of that. It can also be planet hopping in science fiction. And that is where you just constantly go to a bunch of different planes. They might be smaller demi-planes. It might be just a short trip onto a larger plane. As part of your goal of whatever you're doing, maybe if it's a MacGuffin quest, you have to collect a little bit from here or there. If you're trying to find your way home, you're going wherever the portals will take you.
Or you might be trying to escape something.
Yes, you could be running away from something. So that's one type. The other type from planar hopping is basically the story where you go onto one specific new plane. And in that one, the focus is on what's different in this plane. What is life like in this plane? And you really want to use that plane to draw a contrast to the normal that you're experiencing when you're not on the plane. And go more in depth about that one plane, because it's all about that plane rather than about a journey where you're constantly going to different planes.
So you're more likely to want to lean into different mechanical as well as social features that make things different for your PCs when they're there. Which laws of physics work differently? Which types of magic work differently? How do... what might be differences in prevalence of, different, is there an entirely different set of ancestries that lives there? What sort of societal structures might be there that are uncommon or completely unseen in the world that the PCs come from? Do you have what areas depend upon the properties of that plane to exist in the way that they do, where they couldn't exist that way in sort of the material plane? Do you have a place on the plane of air that is, made up of all sorts of like floating chunks of rock that are, populated on every angle, and then people kind of just drop off and fly among them? Do you have a place, what does power generation look like in places like that? What does food look like in places like that? What are the things that, because the things that people fundamentally need are going to be acquired in different ways. The way they're going to structure society and the kinds of conflicts they're going to have are different too.
So as Linda was saying, when you take that type of planar adventure that is, we can just call it a trip rather than an Odyssey where you go to one place, depth becomes important because you want to show the depth of that place. Think through all of the eventualities, all of the ways things work together. Whereas on the sort of Odyssey through a ton of different places, it's more about breadth. You don't need to think that deeply into the area because you need to focus on putting in like the most salient, in some ways stereotypical aspects of those planes, so that that short time that you spend there is going to live in the head of your player and is going to feel very vibrant to your players and the characters for that short time that you have there.
It parallels advice for NPC design. If you're making an NPC that's just going to be a one-off NPC that you want to be memorable but is only going to appear for one or a few sessions, giving them some kind of a notable personality quirk or something like that to really make them stand out, that might be something you do more. Whereas with a recurring and important NPC, then that may be less important because you can focus on giving them depth in other ways.
Exactly. And so that's the same situation when you're dealing with these planar stories in these two different components. So knowing what your goal is and what type of planar story you're telling are, I would say, two of the most important ways to start yourself off to make sure that your planar journey is not going to fall flat right from the beginning. And that's something, like I said before at the beginning of the episode, that I learned by my own experience with. I just liked planes so much that when I was just starting out in, like in middle school and high school, I would just sometimes have them go to the plains, and I didn't have a good reason. And they would just go there because I thought the plains were cool. And there was a plot device that was in it, so it was sort of fit into some of the examples Linda talked about where you're going for a MacGuffin, or like the enemies have also gone onto the plains. But it wasn't it wasn't invested deeply into, at least not all for all of the players.
It wasn't like those sessions of the first campaign that I was in, where we had our adventure of going to hell, and where like PCs are picking up all sorts of powers by accepting temptations and getting involved in like this infernal politics and being completely in over their heads.
Well, that's because you guys decided you wanted to go to hell to try to save the NPC who sold his soul to hell.
Yeah, we did. He was a really friendly NPC.
Yeah.
And then it was just like, oh my gosh, what can we trust?
The important part about that is it was player motivated.
Yeah.
Right? And it wasn't just me being like, but the bad guys have gone into the plains and now you're going to go to the plains.
Yeah.
And so that being player motivated can definitely help when you're telling any kind of journey story.
Like, for example, some of these might come about where the player is asking for something that is, the player's like, well, I want to learn about this rare ritual or something like that, or have some way to do this really off-the-wall difficult thing. What could it take to do this? So, like, I had an adventure about where the PCs had found like a crash flying sky city that led to them being like, okay, how do we restore this so it can fly again? Okay, well, you could find, magic like this isn't really around anymore, but then they figured out that they maybe could go to the plane of air to acquire things, and then we had all kinds of shenanigans with people insulting genies and getting all sorts of nonsense going on there.
When you're looking at making your planar trip memorable, especially if it's one of those Odyssey types where you have to go to a lot of planes and you have to do it without a lot of time to develop the depth, you want to be looking at a few crucial components of those planes so that you can get them across as easily as possible to your group. So you want to be looking at visuals, inhabitants, environments, and magic, I would say, are the four main things. So with visuals, try to paint a picture of what it looks like to be on this plane, why it's different than the material plane. You don't have to write like a giant epic about what the plane is, but focus on what isn't the same as what they've seen before.
And you could also broaden visuals to be other sensory experiences. Is the plane dramatically hotter or colder? Does the plane have an unusual smell? Is there a difference in the way that sound works on the plane?
Exactly.
Is there a constant feeling of pressure because gravity is higher here, or lightness? What does it feel like to be
feel and seem off to the characters? And then when it comes to inhabitants, you want to focus on who lives here. Is it just like humans with a slightly different thing to them? Usually not on most planes.
Yeah.
And so when you focus on the inhabitants, you can try to have some different groups of inhabitants who show up.
Yeah, because
they show off that they have a different culture, and they show off that they have a different viewpoint and mindset for being on the plane. And the way that they act can help explain that the plane is different in a way that is showing without telling.
And, remember that, some of the older visual media that has to do with sort of these sci-fi travel stories and things like that were constrained by the fact that you have human actors who then have to wear different like makeup and props. And so, it was a lot more practical to make very human looking people from other worlds. Whereas, you can definitely go a lot more like, if you're looking at like what Starfinder does, where it's like, oh yeah, this person is like some kind of a floating jellyfish brain or something like that. You can make people look really different.
So the next thing to talk about is environment. So what does the environment of this plane like? Is it made entirely of fire?
Mm-hmm.
Is it all water? I mean, it doesn't have to be an elemental plane. It can have other different things like mountains of crystal in the background, or maybe candy mountains in this plane. Whatever the plane is, the environment is going to tell a lot about it, and it's going to be something that's tied into the descriptive part as well. Because the environment is going to potentially present hazards and dangers for the PCs, but it could provide opportunities or just areas of wonder for the PCs as well. And so then the last thing is magic, because in our world there isn't magic to worry about. So if you were doing some pure sci-fi story that did not have magic, then you're not looking at this for your planets.
But you could, in that case, you might be looking at technology level instead.
If they have a weird technology that is indistinguishable from magic, then it can be very similar. It's like, oh, how does this technology work? They're more advanced in this particular way. But in terms of a fantasy setting, and you're looking at magic, how is magic different here on this other plane? Is fire magic easier? Is water magic harder? That's a very simple way to change magic, but there can also just be weird magic occurrences that blend in with the previous one environment, because there could be like environmental situations that are themselves also magical on this plane.
Yeah, it's like, is it maybe that like whenever you cast a water spell that it's also electrified? Or, there could be a lot weirder influences, or like certain magic is the shorter time that the PCs are in a place, or the more you're willing to like mess with things. You can pull levers in pretty ridiculous directions of being like, magic of a particular type is always heightened or like diminished or things like that.
Absolutely. And so when you're dealing with weird magical effects or
its range is messed with in a particular way,
or environmental effects, they can help you make the plane feel like different, unusual, and even dangerous to be on that plane without necessarily making it so hostile to the players and their characters that the players just want to leave, and the characters also just want to leave, and that they feel like stressed and like they're not having fun, and the encounters are just super difficult, or you have to go in at higher levels. By highlighting and emphasizing these features like in the story, or possibly with a hazard where you deal with them then, but not continually pressing down on them sort of like in a way that is unrelenting.
Yeah, so for example, if they were in a place that was constantly on fire, maybe they have a certain duration of large amounts of fire resistance that they all have up on them, which means that they don't really have to worry about the fire except for when they go through the inferno room. However, they also know that they can't take their time with the dungeon because they have a limited amount of fire defenses.
Exactly. That's a great way to do it. You can do something similar with being underwater and magic that helps you last underwater. And
because you don't want to like necessarily have a thing where it's like, oh, this magic completely counteracts the thing that makes this plane different.
Right. Or if you have like pockets of radiation on the plane, but only like deadly radiation in some areas. But other than that, it just kind of like has this long-term ambient effect, so that you always know there's radiation. Maybe it's like every day you might like progress a slow disease from the radiation, and then there's pockets of areas where it will actually do poison damage to you right now as you're passing through. So
another thing you could do, for example, is maybe the PCs have something that lets them deal with the environment somewhat, but the creatures that are native to that area are very good at dealing with it. So it's like, oh yeah, we're on the water planet and we figured out a way to get ourselves a swim speed, but our swim speed isn't like the swim speed of the creatures that live here.
That's right.
For example.
So Baumwolf in chat is wondering about the fact that sometimes it feels like, since the planes are, super diverse and big, that you could put almost anything onto any plane, and so it's hard to decide what to put onto a particular plane. So in this case, restrictions are your friend. That's why, especially if you're doing a short journey to that plane, you shouldn't don't force yourself to think about the fact that, yes, technically on the plane of air, even on the plane of air, there's pockets of earth and fire and water and everything could be there. But it just be like, I want this to be the most plane of airist adventure that shows off things for the plane of air. Like when Linda was writing a Pathfinder First Edition adventure that was on the plane of air, and was like, I want to show off all of like the most stereotypical things from the plane of air.
We're gonna have an encounter with subjective directional gravity. We're gonna do all this. We're gonna have an encounter in a place that uses like a big hollow space in the center. And we're gonna have like an area where people are doing all sorts of wind-based entertainment.
Yes. So you can just use these restrictions to breed your creativity by asking yourself, what are the most exciting archetypical things that you might associate with this plane? And yes, technically, it's infinitely large. There's other things that aren't exactly as archetypical, that aren't exactly the paradigm of this plane. But why not show off the paradigm of this plane if it's a temporary visit?
Yeah, and whatever it is about that place that makes the PCs want to or need to go there is probably not necessarily something... It's probably something that is more different from their home, because otherwise, why couldn't they have just taken care of it back where they were? Or, there might be a situation where there's a sort of transitory zone in between the planes, too. It doesn't even have to be... Maybe it's not like an instantaneous travel in that sense, but they're heading down a tunnel and it's like getting hotter and hotter as they're going toward the plane of fire or hell or something like that, and they're gradually adapting to it. But you're really getting into something that's different from what you're used to.
Exactly. Different is the key. Think about what your players and their characters' baseline expectations are. When you're going to a plane, if you have options and you can pick whatever you want, think about a way you can shake up some of those expectations, but maybe not completely crush all of those expectations at the same time in such a way that the players are adrift and being like, what am I even supposed to do? This is a plane where all 5 of my main things I do all don't work.
Yeah.
And I don't even know what I'm doing
Another
anymore.
thing that, if you're going to do something that shuts PCs down pretty hard, then having that be like, okay, there's one encounter that's like really the puzzle encounter of how to figure this out. Another thing that can be useful in the same way that, when you first start a new campaign, you're not going to be like, hi, new party, severe encounters, have fun with that. You're going to give them a chance to ease into their characters and the way that the world works. It can often be useful, particularly when you're going to spend a longer time and get into more dangerous stuff on a plane, to give the PCs a taste of things in a less dangerous way, so that then they can figure out how to use those mechanics to their advantage later on.
Yes.
Having role-play encounters, having easier threat combat encounters.
An easier fight so that they first learn the thing about the plane.
Maybe you have an initial challenge that's like figuring out a solution to deal with a particular problem, and then afterwards it's like, you generally have a plan for this. You've created a shelter that lets you survive.
Because if you do a low threat or trivial threat encounter using those different restrictions on the plane, it's going to be easier to handle that if it's your first time, and then you're going to be like, okay, we figured out roughly how to change things up. Now we can throw in the harder fight on that plane. Another thing to consider if you want people to be excited about the planes is, obviously, these are planes and they're creatures who live on those planes, and they're good at living on those planes, and you are not good at living on those planes because you're from your own plane. And that is true. And when you're thinking about it ecologically, it's especially true. But from a gameplay and fun perspective, if you want people to have fun on planes and get that sense of wonder, you might not want to limit the special aspects of the planes that we've been talking about to only be things that are like, oh, this is going to be a problem for you. The denizens are fine with it. You might want certain aspects of the planes to be something that is an opportunity for people on those planes to have the chance to do something cool or different that they couldn't do before. So, when you close a door, maybe you open a window. So, for instance, if you had a plane of air where it was just like, this is air, all the PCs are falling all the time unless they had flying. I guess you should have had flying. You're just constantly screaming and falling all the time that you're on there. That would be worse than the idea of now the gravity is subjective and you can kind of make it change, and then now you're just flying in here too, because that gives them a chance to fly like they couldn't do before, even if the air creatures have an advantage and are better at doing it there. And so that is a good example of that principle at work.
Another thing is that, even if your quest isn't specifically gather the blank that because you can't get it in your world, having the PCs acquire things that they can then bring back home that they couldn't have gotten elsewise, rare spells that don't really exist on their world of origin, rare items, that sort of thing, that they, rare character options.
That's right. You can also just have...
Or allies that they might bring back with them who have unique knowledge and perspectives.
You can also just have different things on certain planes that are advantages for particular characters. Like maybe on this particular plane that is a very mental plane that you went to, your character who uses lots of mental attack spells, their spells are just more powerful there. And sure, yeah, the monsters also use mental attacks and they're more powerful too. But that way that character could be like, whoa, I'm so strong on this plane, guys. Maybe I should just build my fortress on this plane where my mind spells are super awesome. So think about ways to make the PCs either feel stronger at what they do or be able to do something that they could never do before. So you could come up with an idea that like, maybe on this electricity plane that you're coming up with, like the PCs become able to like charge their metal weapons up with electricity and do these like charged electric attacks with them.
You do want to be sure that whatever the cool thing that the PCs can do is, that there's some way to put it to use. Because, charging electric attacks would be really awesome, but if every single thing on that entire plane is immune to electricity, then it's kind of like...
It can be a serious issue. So you might want to make it so that electricity plane that we're coming up with here has, like, different kinds of denizens. Like, maybe the electricity plane has, like, positive and negative charge. And, like, they both do electricity damage, but the positive charge is, like... immune to other positive charges, weak against the negative charge, and the negative charge is weak against the positive charge. So the PCs are going to have to find a way to like alternate their charge with the correct tempo to attack these different creatures. Like possibly like attacking a creature and discharging will like change you to their charge, and so you have to like alternate who you're attacking with these special electric attacks to get a different advantage.
Yeah, or if it's a treasure that you get, near the very end of your journey in the plane, then it's like, oh, okay, yeah, now this is something that I don't worry about the fact I can't use this right now because I know I'll be able to use this soon when I get back.
Exactly. Or in a plane that's morphic, like a dream plane, you could have it so that player characters with strong wills or a connection to dreams can just lucid dreams shape the plane around them.
Then again, if it's something that's about... using the power of the plane to defend yourself from something in that plane. That could be very useful. The mantle that gives you fire resistance is going to be a lot more useful than the glove that makes you punch for fire damage on the plane of fire.
Absolutely. And so just think of some ways that you can make the players and their characters excited about the plane, and especially if it allows an aspect of the characters that is kind of underused in certain ways or underlooked on the regular material plane to become really important when you're going on to this other plane.
And another thing that folks are talking about a bit in chat is skills gaining unusual or different uses.
Absolutely.
Is a different skill are you rolling a different skill to do certain things? Do you need, on this plane... that in this plane of the mind, is occultism doing things that normally other skills would do, or will saves doing something that skills would do, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. And so there's a question from chat of, would it be better to just give players an ability to go to other planes with spells or control planar travels with NPCs and places? In general, it depends on what kind of planar adventure you're trying to tell, but in most cases, it's easier to tell an interesting planar adventure if you're using something like special portals or locations to go to the planes. A let's get home isn't even a story anymore if it's just like, oh, well, all right, we're stuck somewhere. I plane shift back home. Oh, you're back home.
It maybe you could do that in sort of if it's like, we need to gather the ingredients for the ritual that will allow us to go back home, but then they're expended, or like, because the more that you can sort of hop back and forth, not only does that maybe make going back and forth seem less cool, but also you're less immersed in the dangers and opportunities of the location that you're in, the new cool location, if you can just pop back to your favorite inn or your favorite local tavern or your favorite store every night.
In fact,
get whatever you need.
Earlier in this episode, Linda literally said that you couldn't go back to your store in the middle of the Planar Adventures, which was presupposing that you didn't have the ability to just easily do that.
Usually you don't necessarily want that, because otherwise you're like, it makes it feel more like a dungeon you're briefly popping into, and it allows PCs to avoid engaging with some of the more interesting content and questions that arise. So, maybe there's there's something where you can maybe there's something where you can go in, a limited number of times, or like this thing activates once every month to allow you to transfer across. So the PCs can decide when they go in, but then they're going to be in there for a while. And in chat, folks are talking about, at some point, once you might get to a point where you're super high level and you want players to feel sort of powerful in this reality bending way. I think that would work best for, they're now quite familiar with both planes. They've now overcome a lot of the challenges on it, and maybe they're doing an adventure that requires them to be able to move back and forth to do things. Like maybe they need to coordinate between people in multiple areas for some kind of like giant assault on a citadel in hell or something like that.
And even then, having unrestricted, unlimited, quick access between different planes is something that just like sort of notoriously can jar things.
Yeah.
In fact, I can hardly even think of any of those traditional, hey, the 5th book of this 6-book adventure path is going to a plane, that didn't put special extra limitations on the planar travel specifically to prevent you from doing that, because the authors were like, oh, we have to put this limitation in here because otherwise, like Lynn said, they just go back to the inn and like they're not like telling a story about being on this plane. So they were like, this is a special plane of fire, city of brass dungeon that you can't get out of. Or this is a special research place that can't be plane shifted into with normal plane shift.
Mm-hmm. They all put those things in for a reason. But what I was saying is, like, you could hypothetically tell a story, but in that case, it's less about... It's more about, like, oh, you're going to a cool dungeon or a cool area, and it's less about, like, the fact that it's on that plane at that point. Also, whatever the method that is there... the more prominent it is, the more naturally there would be interaction between those planes in your setting. So if you make it easy in your setting to travel back and forth between the planes, then, you should have fairly sizable enclaves of people who come from one plane, each plane living on the other, and things like that.
Exactly. And honestly, the ability to just kind of like jarringly enter or leave the plane in such a way that you're not really interacting with it is not necessarily the only hallmark of how to feel powerful with planes, right? Like, you could still have a limitation on how to enter the plane, but do it in like the most badass way possible, where it's like, okay, we're still putting limitations, but you arrive on the plane with you and your allies are riding like down in meteors that strike down into this army of demons and explode, killing hundreds of demons as you arrive, and you come out of those craters, and now you are in the abyss. And like that is something that establishes your power, and but can still be like a limited ritualistic way of going there, in a way that is kind of more epic and mythic feeling than just, oh, I guess I leave. Oh, I guess I come back. But at the same time can still like help the narrative be easier to tell while feeling powerful.
Yeah, and I think, the closest thing to that also that I can think of is, traveling between distant planets, say, in more of like a Starfinder type situation where you are traveling between planets. But in many cases then you have, those planets don't feel as different from each other as, say, planes would in a fantasy story, because they have that interaction and they say, okay, the planets in that case become almost more like countries would on a planet-based setting, where
cities
or cities or things like that. And so they're able to have more dramatic differences between them, but they don't feel the same way. And what Ice Python's talking about here is a fun trope where, plane warping used to be as simple as walking down the street to get a burger, but then there was a catastrophe that shook everything up and made it dangerous. And
oh no, a drift crisis.
A drift crisis, yes, exactly. So, you can have a thing where, and then you can explore, like, well, who's stuck where, and what does it mean to try to get things back to the way that they were?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's just a great storytelling device. We used to have an easier way to do this. Now we don't. What does that mean? What are the implications of being interconnected and then suddenly not interconnected anymore?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so that is a way to almost turn something that wouldn't have been a Planar Odyssey normally into a Planar Odyssey when the place that had seemed like it had become familiar due to the fact that it was interconnected to other planes gets cut off from other planes at that point. And then now it starts drifting back to becoming its own sort of distinct plane because of the fact that it doesn't have a connection to your normal home world like it did before.
Someone asked about like how you deal with plane shift.
Well, it's uncommon. So you can just not give it to the PCs if it's going to cause an issue.
It also requires having a correct planar key. So the PCs would need to find the correct key to use it.
It's also highly imprecise and appears somewhere between 25 and 500 miles from the last place one of the targets was located the last time they were on that plane.
Or a random location if nobody's gone there before.
Correct. So it has some limitations that make it less convenient because you might be 500 miles away from where you want it to be. You can't just go back to your favorite inn. You can go 200 miles from your favorite inn and then 200 miles from where you want it to be at the end. And it's got the limitations of the planar keys, and it's uncommon, so you can just not give it if you want to not give it. So
and then when you're
easy to just not allow it.
You could have a location where a location or reason why, like a lot of the stories that, like a lot of the Paizo Adventure Pass written settings that do have those kinds of spells. A location or reason why, hey, when you're here, you can't necessarily just be jumping back and forth.
Absolutely.
Whether that is some kind of a restriction in the area that seals off the ability to travel back and forth, or like, someone who is watching the PCs and is going to notice if they stop guarding whatever they're trying to work on, or things like that.
That's right. So in that sense, you have the guidelines we gave about the different kinds of planar stories, both in terms of whether it's an odyssey versus a visit to a single plane.
Another thing
versus also in terms of the reasons that you are going to travel to the plane. And then we talked about the ways that you could express the plane and describe a plane quickly to your characters and your players, as well as how to sort of motivate the plane's differences and powers in a way that makes it not seem like purely a hindrance or some kind of annoying thing that they have to deal with, and how to use planar travel in your overall stories in such a way that it feels interesting, but not just like I guess we're going to the local convenience store.
Yeah. And I think also making your method not be instantaneous. Like the, interplanar teleport, formerly known as plane shift, takes 10 minutes to cast. So if your planar travel is something that takes some time to activate, then you're not going to be having players, for example, using it as a means to escape in the middle of combat or things like that. It's going to be something where you need to be in a safe location where you're not being attacked and then able to sit down for a while and say, okay, now we're going to travel.
Your players the characters can't be just like, ew, I'm not going to go to the bathroom on the plane of fire. I'm going back home. Because then they might be 500 miles away when they come back.
Yeah, and maybe you can add in like an expensive component that it takes each time you do the jump, or a rare component, so you can't be just doing it willy-nilly.
There's a lot of ways to alter and shift things to make sure that the planar travel fits the story and narrative that you're looking for and can excite and delight your players with the differences and the way that you shake up expectations, rather than just make it seem like a massive chore and they wish they could go back to the main plot. Mm-hmm. So, Linda, did you have any other tips that you wanted to tell?
That was what I had in mind.
In that case, please hit the bell and subscribe if you want to see more. Even join if you're really interested, and we will have a vote for the next episode
in a week. So I see that Nutbag voted for 3
is 5.
and Math Guys voted for 5 vehicles. Did we get any other votes during the episode? I don't think so.
No, we did not. So vote for 1 for Build a Hazard Workshop, 2 for Ask Arcane Mark, Save My Game Q&A, 3 for Design Diaries, Skills and Proficiencies, 4 for Arcane Mark Plays, where we'll play a game here, or 5 for Vehicles.
We have a vote for 2.
So there's a 6th topic of how to get into, I guess, indie TTRPGs. So like not Pathfinder or D&D.
Yeah, I assume it doesn't mean D&D.
Yeah, not Pathfinder or D&D. Adding in 6 for expanding your TTRPG horizons.
So it looks like 5 has another vote, is the first one to get a second vote.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Well, if 5 or 6 wins, we can retain whichever of them didn't win this time and just have it be 5 and then 6 be other next time.
That's true. Mm-hmm. We absolutely can.
I really like when people suggest episode ideas in chat.
Let's see. So we have
another 5.
Another 5, and then another 6.
No, that's Rohit saying.
That's the same 6.
For his idea, I think.
An Ice Fire Python. It would not be rude to ask a question about Battle Zoo's dragons.
There was a question previously, I think, that I saw at one point about if the new ones were going to be put into a book, like the adamantine one and stuff.
Oh, they almost. It's going to be very difficult because we can really only publish things if they are either in both Orc and OGL or our own creation due to weird licensing stuff. So it's going to be very challenging to publish something that is only in Orc for that reason. It's not impossible, but it's also not easy to do. So that's going to be my answer on that. We'd like to. Obviously, we love dragons. We want to make as many dragons as possible.
Oh, the dragons.
All of the dragons.
You're working on dragons right now, aren't you? Well, not literally right now.
I mean, not literally right now, but
like
just
today.
A few hours ago,
yep.
I was. I'm getting there on Misfit Dragons PF2. Mm-hmm. If it wasn't the longest of all of the books from Secret Dragons, then it would be just about
For a while, you've been doing dragons while I do dinos, but I turned in my dino.
Dinos and dragons.
Dinos and dragons.
All right, so I think that number 5 has won.
Yeah, vehicles has got it.
So we can talk about like the idea of vehicles and sort of how to use them in an abstract way, and then why the like sort of nitty gritty vehicle systems that tend to be included in TTRPGs tend to be a little bit tricky to use and not always easy to use when we discuss vehicles overall.
Oh, I think right, was that another idea for Rising with feat improvisations? Rising Star PF2 has been talking about feat improvisations. I'm not sure if that was
Or just saying
that's a specific idea for an episode.
I'm not sure. Rico wants to know where the Eldamon dragons are, why there aren't dragons for every Battle Zoo element. Well, you know what? The Primal Dragons already cover some of the Battle Zoo elements to begin with. They cover 5 of the 20, so you would just need... And, you know, some of the other dragons cover other elements, like Etheric Dragon is Sword of Spirit, and Astral Dragon is Mind. So
I feel like Death would be like a Ravener type thing.
Or even Crypt Dragon, though.
Yeah.
And Solar Dragon is kind of light. So if you go through it enough, you could probably find that a lot of them are covered by some kind of dragon. There's got to be at least one that breeds
poison for poison.
Oh, there's a bunch that breeds
poison. And Body's got to be there, too.
Body, yeah, there are definitely some possibilities for Body and for some of these other ones. All right, so I think that Rising Star PF2 said it could be a different video of like feat improvisation. We do have a video about feat improvisation. It's a short pre-recorded video.
Rising Star talked about it in the previous video.
Yeah, but I think that it wouldn't be good to make a video where like people who officially worked on Pathfinder attempt to like set a baseline for improvisation, because the strength of improvisation is that it's improvised and that you can do what's right for your group, rather than be like, well, Mark Seifter and Linda Zeiss Palmer said you should just do you should do this thing, which is not in the rules but is an improvisation. I think that like the idea is you need to set what's right for your group.
Some groups would prefer to have those kinds of things be like, hey, I'm gonna make a skill feat for like acrobatics that is something about wall running, or I'm gonna make like a class feat that's something about wall running, or I'm just gonna let everybody wall run, or that kind of thing.
Rico demands codified
improvisation. But I feel like if there's something that a lot of folks in your group really want to do, then that seems like a good candidate for something to either open up as something folks can do. Maybe they can do with a skill check. Maybe they have a feat that they can take to get to do it. Stuff like that. Absolutely.
So, if we did do a topic on it, it wouldn't actually give any suggestions of how you should improvise, because you should improvise the way that's right for you. It would be more about how to approach your group in discussing improvisation and like how to come up with an improvisation regimen for your group.
That could be an interesting topic. I think
it could.
Ironically, that's not an episode I think we could improvise. I think we're gonna need to do more planning in advance for that one, to make sure that we don't accidentally slip into giving examples.
Well, all we would have to do is just not give any examples, but instead talk about how you would discuss it. So I think we could put that in there. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to put 7 so that I can see this in the chat. How to discuss improvisation with your group. That way, if I check the chat, I'll see that it was on there.
Yes.
All right. So, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great week. We will see you on Saturday for an episode that was about... What was it about, Linda?
Battlefield control.
Battlefield control. So if you want to know what's the deal with battlefield control, why do some people say it's the strongest type of thing in the game, we will be talking about that on Saturday. Take care, everyone. See you next time.
Bye.